The candles were lit. 39 of them, one for every year, plus one for good luck, arranged on a cake. I had spent 2 hours decorating myself, because I am the kind of woman who still believes a birthday should feel like something, even when the year behind you has been the hardest of your life. Everyone was singing. My in-laws. My own parents, who had driven 3 hours from Lancaster to be there. My husband's 2 business partners and their wives. And sitting directly across the table from me, in the seat my husband had personally arranged for her, was his secretary, Vanessa Cole, smiling and singing along with everyone else like she had every right to be in my dining room on my birthday. I picked up the knife. I looked at my husband, Richard, sitting at the head of the table with his hand resting just slightly too close to the back of Vanessa's chair. And as I lowered the blade into the cake, my phone began to buzz against the table. I glanced down. 3 words on the screen, from a name I had saved under a different label, so no one in this house would ever think to question it. Diane Whitfield, attorney. I set the knife down very carefully, frosting still on the blade, and I smiled at the room. "Excuse me for one moment," I said. "I should take this." No one at that table had any idea what was about to happen to their evening, but I had been planning it for 6 weeks. My name is Caroline Hayes. I am 39 years old, as of the night I just described to you. I run a small interior design firm in Hartford, Connecticut, the kind of business that started in my garage 11 years ago, and now has 4 employees and a waiting list. I built it slowly, carefully, the same way I have built everything in my adult life, with patience, with attention to detail, and with the assumption that if you do things properly, they tend to hold together. I want you to remember that about me as the story unfolds, because it matters enormously for what I eventually did. I am not an impulsive woman. I have never once, in my entire adult life, made an important decision in anger. Everything I am about to describe, the dinner, the phone call, the cake, all of it, was the result of 6 weeks of careful, deliberate planning. My husband, Richard Hayes, is 44. He owns a commercial insurance brokerage with 2 partners, a business that has done extremely well over the past decade, due in no small part to his charm, his sharp instincts, and his genuine talent for making people feel like the most important person in the room. I fell in love with that talent 14 years ago. I am only now, looking back, beginning to understand how indiscriminately he applies it. We married 12 years ago, in a small ceremony at a vineyard in the Connecticut countryside, with 60 guests and string lights and my father giving a toast that made the whole room laugh and then cry. We built a life together that looked from the outside like exactly the kind of life people hope for. A beautiful house in West Hartford. 2 successful careers. Long vacations every summer. The easy, comfortable rhythm of 2 people who had figured out how to share a life without too much friction. For most of those 12 years, I believed that rhythm was real. The first sign that something had shifted came about 1.5 years ago, not long after Richard hired a new executive assistant for his office. Vanessa Cole. 29 years old, sharp, capable, the kind of assistant who could anticipate problems before they happened. Qualities Richard mentioned to me more than once, in the early months, with the casual enthusiasm of a man praising a good hire. I did not think anything of those comments at the time. Why would I have? My husband had hired a competent employee. That is not a crime. That is, in fact, exactly what running a successful business requires. But over the following months, the references to Vanessa accumulated in a way I did not notice consciously until much later, when I went back through my memory the way you go back through a contract looking for the clause you missed the first time. Vanessa handled that beautifully. Vanessa thought of something I hadn't considered. Vanessa stayed late again. She's incredibly dedicated. Dedication. That was the word he used most often. I believed for a long time that it referred to her work ethic. The thing about a 14-year relationship is that you develop a kind of baseline understanding of a person's rhythms, when they're stressed, when they're tired, when something is bothering them that they haven't said out loud yet. About 8 months ago, Richard's rhythm began to change in a way I noticed, but could not initially name. He started working later. Not dramatically later, an extra hour here, an extra hour there, but consistently, in a pattern that didn't match the seasonal demands of his business the way it had in previous years. He started taking phone calls outside on the back porch, even in weather that didn't justify standing outside for the length of those calls. He started being, in a way I can only describe as performative, more attentive to me at home, bringing home flowers without occasion, complimenting things he hadn't noticed in years. The specific, slightly overcorrected kindness of a man managing guilt by being visibly good in the areas he could control. I noticed all of it. I dismissed all of it. I told myself I was imagining patterns where none existed, the way anxious people sometimes do, the way I had specifically trained myself not to do, because I pride myself on being a rational person who does not catastrophize without evidence. The evidence came eventually. It always does if you are patient enough and pay close enough attention. It started with an expense report. I do the bookkeeping for my own design firm, and over the years, Richard and I had developed a habit of occasionally cross-checking each other's business expenses for tax purposes, a small, practical intimacy that came from running two businesses out of the same household. About 7 weeks before my birthday, I was helping him organize quarterly expenses for his accountant when I came across a hotel charge in Mystic, Connecticut, dated a Thursday 2 months earlier. I remembered that Thursday specifically because Richard had told me he was in Boston that week for a regional conference. Mystic is not on the way to Boston. Mystic is 90 minutes in almost the opposite direction. I did not say anything immediately. I want to be very clear about this because it matters for everything that follows. I did not confront him that evening. I did not even fully allow myself to feel the full weight of what I was looking at. I simply made a note, a private, internal note, and I kept looking. Over the following 2 weeks, looking carefully and quietly, the way you examine a structure for cracks before you decide whether the whole building needs to come down, I found more. A second hotel charge, 3 weeks after the first, in a different town, with the same suspicious mismatch against his stated travel schedule. A pattern of late-night text messages on his work phone, which I happened to glance at while it sat charging on the kitchen counter one evening, the screen lighting up with a name I recognized immediately from Vanessa at hours that had nothing to do with office business. A receipt found in his jacket pocket on its way to the dry cleaner for a jewelry store in downtown Hartford. A delicate gold bracelet, dated the same week as our wedding anniversary. He had not given me a bracelet for our anniversary. He had taken me to dinner. He had been, that night, unusually attentive, unusually warm, in the specific way I now recognized as performance rather than genuine affection. I sat with all of this for several days before I called anyone. I needed to be certain in my own mind that I was seeing what I was actually seeing before I let another person into the picture. I was certain. My best friend, Janine, has been my closest confidant since we were roommates in design school 20 years ago. I called her on a Tuesday evening, sitting in my car in the parking lot of my own office because I could not bring myself to have this conversation inside the house Richard and I shared. "I need you to listen to something," I said. "And I need you to not react emotionally yet. I need to just lay it out." "Okay," she said, her voice already careful. "Go ahead." I told her everything. The hotel charges, the texts, the bracelet that never arrived in my jewelry box. When I finished, there was a long silence on her end. "Caroline," she said finally, "how long have you known?" "Officially? About a week. Unofficially, I think I've known for months and refused to look at it directly." "What do you want to do?" I had thought about this question for days before I called her. "I want to handle this properly," I said. "Not emotionally. Not in a way that gives him room to manage me, or apologize his way out of consequences, or turn this into something softer than what it actually is." "What does properly look like?" "I'm going to call a lawyer," I said, before I say a single word to him. Janine exhaled slowly. "Good," she said. "That's exactly right." Diane Whitfield's office was on the 4th floor of a converted Victorian house in downtown Hartford, the kind of space that managed to feel both professional and reassuringly human at the same time. She was in her early 50s, with sharp eyes and a manner that immediately communicated she had handled situations far more complicated than mine and was not going to be rattled by any of it. I told her everything in our first meeting. The hotel charges, the timeline, the bracelet, the pattern of behavior over the past 8 months. She took careful notes, asking precise questions, never once reacting with anything other than calm professional focus. Connecticut is an equitable distribution state, she said when I finished, which means the court divides marital assets fairly, though not necessarily equally, based on a number of factors, including, in some cases, dissipation of marital assets for an affair, which is exactly what those hotel charges and that bracelet represent. What does that mean practically? It means we document everything, Diane said. Every dollar he spent pursuing this relationship is a dollar that can factor into how assets are divided later. The more thoroughly we document it now, before he has any reason to suspect you know, the stronger your position becomes. He doesn't know I know, I said. I haven't said anything. Diane looked at me with something that might have been approval. Good, she said. Keep it that way for now. The single biggest mistake people make in situations like this is confronting their spouse before they've protected themselves. The moment you say something, he has the opportunity to hide assets, alter financial records, or simply become more careful about covering his tracks. Right now, you have the advantage of surprise. I want you to keep that advantage as long as possible. For how long? As long as it takes to build an airtight picture, she said. And in the meantime, we need to talk about protecting your own business and your own finances independently of his. I left her office that afternoon with a folder of instructions and a feeling I had not expected. Not devastation, though the devastation was certainly still there, somewhere underneath. What I felt, walking to my car, was something closer to purpose. A sense that I finally had a structure to work within, a process, a series of concrete steps that would lead somewhere specific rather than simply spinning in the chaos of betrayal. I am, as I said, a woman who believes in doing things properly. Diane had just given me a proper way to do this. Over the following 5 weeks, I became, in essence, 2 different people simultaneously. In the version of my life that Richard saw, nothing had changed. I went to work. I came home. I asked him about his day and listened to his increasingly elaborate explanations of late nights and out-of-town meetings, nodding along, occasionally asking a follow-up question that I already knew the real answer to, just to test how easily the lies came to him. They came very easily. I want to note that because it surprised me. Not that he was lying, but how comfortable he had become at it, how smoothly the explanations rolled out, with none of the hesitation or guilt-driven stammering I might have expected from a man who claimed, on our wedding day, to love me more than anything in the world. In the other version of my life, the private one, the one Richard had no idea existed, I was documenting everything. I went through 12 months of credit card statements with a forensic precision I did not know I possessed. I found 9 separate hotel charges that did not align with his stated business travel. I found a pattern of withdrawals from a personal account he maintained separately from our joint finances, an account I learned through Diane's recommended forensic accountant that had received deposits totaling almost $11,000 over the past year, money that had no clear business purpose and corresponded suspiciously with the timeline of his relationship with Vanessa. I screenshotted text messages I caught glimpses of when his phone lit up on the counter. I kept a private log, dates, times, observations, building week by week, the same kind of careful documentation I would use for a major design project, except the project, in this case, was the complete and irrefutable case for what my marriage had actually become. Diane's forensic accountant, a methodical man named Gerald Pruitt, met with me twice during this period. Your husband has been careful, he told me, during our second meeting, sliding a report across the table. But not careful enough. People who haven't done this before tend to assume that small, individually unremarkable transactions won't draw attention. They're usually wrong. What did you find? A pattern consistent with an extramarital relationship being financially supported through what appears to be marital assets, he said. Hotel stays, jewelry, restaurant charges at establishments significantly outside his ordinary spending pattern, and the personal account deposits, which appear to be funds diverted from business revenue that should, by all accounts, have been shared marital income. I sat with that report for a long time after our meeting ended. There's one more thing, Diane told me, near the end of that 5th week, when we met to review the complete picture before I made any decisions about timing. Something I think you should be prepared for. What is it? Your husband's business partner, Frank Dillard, called my office 2 days ago, she said. Anonymously, initially, though I recognized his voice from a deposition years back in an unrelated matter. He wanted to know, carefully, without directly implicating himself, whether a wife in your situation would have grounds to pursue a business dissolution claim if it turned out company funds had been misappropriated for personal use. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. Frank knows. It appears so, Diane said. Which means, at minimum, your husband's business partner is aware of what's been happening and possibly concerned about exposure to the business itself if this becomes a legal matter. That's actually useful information for us. It suggests this has been going on long enough and carelessly enough that people around him have noticed. I want to tell you about the moment I decided on the timing of everything: the dinner, the phone call, the specific theater of how this would all come together. It was a Tuesday evening about 10 days before my birthday. I was sitting at my kitchen table reviewing Gerald Pruitt's final report, the complete documented picture of everything Richard had done over the past year, when Richard walked in from work, kissed my cheek with an ease that had become, by this point, almost unbearable to witness, and said, "I was thinking, for your birthday dinner, what if we invited the office? Frank and Marcia, obviously, but also, I thought it might be nice to include Vanessa. She's done so much for the business this year, and honestly, Caroline, I think you two would really get along if you spent more time together." I looked at him. I want to describe, as precisely as I can, what I felt in that moment, because it surprised even me. I did not feel rage. I did not feel the urge to confront him immediately with everything I knew. What I felt was something closer to clarity, a sudden, complete understanding of exactly how this story should end. He wanted to bring his mistress to my birthday dinner. He wanted to sit her at my table, in my house, on the one day of the year that was supposed to be entirely mine, and present this as a thoughtful gesture, an opportunity for me to bond with a woman he had been sleeping with for the better part of a year while diverting our shared finances to fund it. I smiled at him. "That actually sounds lovely," I said. "Invite her." He looked for a half-second, almost surprised by how easily I agreed. Then his face relaxed into something pleased, almost relieved, the expression of a man who believed he had successfully managed a delicate situation. I went upstairs that night and called Diane. "I have an idea," I said, "and I need your help to make it work." The plan, once Diane and I finalized it together, was simple in its construction and devastating in its precision. My birthday dinner would happen exactly as Richard had planned it. Vanessa would attend, seated at the table, presented to my family and friends as his valued executive assistant. The evening would proceed normally. The meal, the conversation, the performance of an ordinary celebration, right up until the cake. I would cut the cake, and at that exact moment, Diane would call my phone. The call itself would not contain any new information. Diane and I both knew that. The actual substance of what needed to happen, the divorce filing, the asset freeze, the formal notification to Richard's business partners about the financial misappropriation, all of that had already been quietly set in motion over the preceding week, timed deliberately to activate that same evening. The call was theater.
I want to be honest about that.
But it was theater built entirely on a foundation of real, documented, legally airtight substance, and the timing of it, the way it would land in the middle of the one moment Richard believed he had successfully orchestrated everything, was, I decided, exactly the ending the story deserved. "You understand," Diane said during our final planning call, "that once this call happens, there's no controlled, quiet version of this anymore. Everyone at that table is going to know something significant is happening. Are you prepared for that?" "I've been preparing for 6 weeks," I said. "I am more than prepared. And you understand the legal filings will already be active by the time you take that call. The divorce petition will be filed that morning. The asset freeze request will already be with the court. Richard's business partners will have already received formal notice of the financial irregularities, timed to arrive that same afternoon. I understand all of it." Then, Diane said, and I could hear something in her voice that might have been quiet approval, "I think we're ready." The week leading up to my birthday passed in a strange, suspended quality of time. Ordinary on the surface, charged with anticipation underneath. I hosted client meetings. I picked fabric samples for a project in Simsbury. I baked in my actual kitchen the cake I would cut on the night everything detonated, layering it carefully the way I do everything with attention and precision. Richard, for his part, seemed almost cheerful that week. I understand now why. He believed he had solved a delicate social problem, finding a way to include his mistress in a family gathering without raising suspicion, and his relief at having apparently succeeded had made him expansive, warm, almost like the man I had married 14 years earlier. I let him believe it. I let him be cheerful. I smiled when he kissed me good morning and asked about my day with what appeared to be genuine interest, and I held my own counsel completely, the way I had been holding it for 6 weeks, building toward a moment he had no idea was coming. My parents arrived from Lancaster on the morning of my birthday. My mother hugged me at the door and said, "You look tired, sweetheart. Is everything all right?" "I'm fine, Mom," I said. "Just a busy week at work." She studied my face for a moment longer than necessary, the way mothers do, sensing something beneath the surface without being able to name it. But she let it go because I did not give her any more to work with, and because some part of me, the careful, controlled part that had been running this entire operation for 6 weeks, needed her to not know yet. Everyone would know soon enough. I needed, for just a few more hours, for the surface to hold. The guests arrived around 6. My in-laws first, then Richard's business partners and their wives, the easy, familiar small talk of a gathering that had happened in some form many times over 12 years of marriage. Vanessa arrived at 6:30, in a dress that was, I noted with the detached precision of someone who had spent 6 weeks documenting every detail of this affair, exactly the kind of dress a woman wears when she wants to seem appropriately professional while still being noticed. She was polite, almost painfully so. She thanked me for the invitation, complimented my house, brought a small gift, a candle, tastefully wrapped, that I accepted with a smile I had practiced extensively in the bathroom mirror over the preceding week. I want you to understand something about how I behaved that entire evening because I think it matters. I was not cold. I was not distant or visibly strained. I was, by every external measure, a gracious hostess celebrating her birthday with warmth and genuine enjoyment. I laughed at the appropriate moments. I refilled wine glasses. I asked Vanessa thoughtful questions about her work, watching her answer with the easy confidence of a woman who had no idea that every word she said was being absorbed by someone who already knew, in granular financial detail, exactly what her relationship with my husband actually was. Richard sat at the head of the table, relaxed, expansive, occasionally resting his hand on the back of Vanessa's chair in a gesture he clearly believed was subtle and which I had, by that point, learned to recognize instantly. Dinner proceeded through 3 courses. Conversation moved easily around the table, Frank Dillard talking about a new client account, my father telling a story about a fishing trip that made everyone laugh, my mother-in-law asking detailed questions about my design firm's latest project that I answered with more enthusiasm than I actually felt in that moment, because some part of me was watching the clock. Diane had agreed to call at exactly 8:15. At 8 o'clock, I went into the kitchen to retrieve the cake. I had decorated it myself 2 days earlier. White buttercream, delicate piped flowers around the base, my name written in careful cursive across the top, surrounded by 39 candles arranged in a careful spiral pattern, plus 1 extra for luck. I carried it to the table myself. The room erupted into the familiar, slightly off-key chorus of Happy Birthday, everyone leaning forward, the candlelight flickering against faces I had known for years and one face I had only known for an hour, all of them singing to me with no idea what was approaching. I set the cake down in front of my seat. I looked around the table, at Richard, smiling, clapping along with the song, at Vanessa, smiling beside him, her hand resting near a wine glass that had been refilled 3 times over the course of the evening, at my parents, my in-laws, the business partners and their wives, all of them gathered in my dining room celebrating a birthday that was about to become something none of them would forget for the rest of their lives. The song ended. Everyone clapped. "Make a wish, sweetheart," my mother said. I closed my eyes for exactly 1 second. I made a wish, though I think, by that point, I already knew it was going to come true because I had spent 6 weeks ensuring it would. I opened my eyes. I picked up the knife. I lowered the blade into the cake, and my phone, sitting on the table beside my plate, began to buzz. I glanced down at the screen. Diane Whitfield, attorney. I looked up. I smiled at the room, the same gracious, hostess smile I had been wearing all evening. "Excuse me for one moment," I said, setting down the knife, frosting still on the blade. "I should take this." I stood up from the table. I walked into the next room, leaving the door slightly open behind me, deliberately because some part of this entire production required that the people at that table hear at least fragments of what came next. "Diane," I said, into the phone, my voice perfectly calm. "Tell me." "Everything's confirmed," she said. "The petition was filed this morning. The court granted the temporary asset freeze on the joint accounts and the business account at 1:30 this afternoon. Frank Dillard's firm received the formal notice of the financial misappropriation findings at 4 o'clock, along with a copy of Gerald Pruitt's complete report."
She paused.
"It's done, Caroline. Everything is in motion exactly as we planned."
"Thank you," I said.
"I'll call you in the morning." I hung up. I stood in the next room for exactly 3 seconds, breathing, allowing myself that brief, private moment before I walked back to a table full of people whose evening was about to change entirely. Then I walked back in. I picked the knife back up. I finished cutting the cake, my hands perfectly steady, and I began passing slices around the table with the same gracious efficiency I had maintained all evening. "Everything all right?" Richard asked, his voice carrying the easy, slightly distracted tone of a man who had no idea his entire world had just legally collapsed 2 rooms away. "Everything's fine," I said, handing him a slice of cake. That was actually my attorney. The room went very slightly, almost imperceptibly still. Frank Dillard's fork paused halfway to his mouth. "Your attorney?" Richard repeated, his smile faltering at the edges, the first flicker of genuine uncertainty I had seen from him all evening. "Yes," I said, setting down the cake server. "I filed for divorce this morning, Richard. The court granted a freeze on our joint accounts and the business account this afternoon." I looked at him steadily. "And Frank's firm received a complete forensic accounting report a few hours ago, detailing exactly where company revenue has been going for the past year." The silence that followed was the kind of silence that has weight. Real, physical weight, pressing down on the entire room. "Caroline," Richard started, his voice cracking on the second syllable. "I think," I said, my voice still perfectly calm, "that everyone at this table deserves to know why Vanessa is here tonight. Don't you, Richard?" Vanessa's face had gone completely white. She set down her wine glass with a hand that was visibly shaking. "I have hotel receipts," I continued, looking now at my parents, at my in-laws, at Frank and Marcia, who were staring at the scene unfolding in front of them with expressions of dawning, horrified understanding. 9 of them over the past year, in towns that had nothing to do with Richard's actual business travel. I have a jewelry receipt for a bracelet I never received, purchased the same week as our anniversary. I have bank records showing almost $11,000 diverted from business revenue into a personal account that funded all of it. "This isn't the time," Richard said, his voice rising now, panic bleeding through the careful composure he had maintained all evening. "It's exactly the time," I said. "You invited her to my birthday dinner, Richard. You wanted me to sit across the table from the woman you've been sleeping with for the better part of a year in my own home and smile about it. I decided you should have the opportunity to explain that to everyone else at this table too." My mother had gone pale. My father's hand had tightened into a fist on the table. Frank Dillard was staring at Richard with an expression that had moved entirely past surprise into something colder and more final. "Richard," Frank said quietly, "is this true?" Richard did not answer. His silence answered for him. Vanessa stood up from the table abruptly, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. "I should go," she said, her voice thin and shaking. "Yes," I agreed. "I think you should." She left without another word, grabbing her coat from the front hallway, the front door closing behind her with a sound that seemed, in the silence of that room, almost deafeningly loud. What happened in the minutes after Vanessa left is something I have replayed many times since, not because I take pleasure in it exactly, but because I think it matters as a complete account of what occurred. Richard tried, briefly, to salvage something. He turned to the table, to his business partners, his in-laws, my parents, and said, Caroline is upset. She's exaggerating. There's an explanation for all of this. Richard. Frank's voice cut through the room with the particular authority of a man who had built an entire career on being believed. I received a forensic accounting report this afternoon, before this dinner even started. I came here tonight already knowing something was deeply wrong, and I was hoping I was wrong about how deeply.
He set down his napkin.
I wasn't wrong. Frank, please let me explain. You can explain to our attorneys, Frank said. Because what that report describes isn't just a personal failing, Richard. It's misappropriation of business funds. That's not a marital issue anymore. That's a partnership issue, and it's going to be handled as one. My father stood up from the table. He did not raise his voice. He simply walked around to where I was standing, put his arm around my shoulders, and said, I think it's time we helped your mother clear the table, Caroline. I understood immediately, his way of giving me an exit from the wreckage I had just detonated, a practical, ordinary task to retreat into while the rest of the room absorbed what had just happened. I let him guide me toward the kitchen. Behind us, I heard Richard's voice rising, pleading, directed now at his in-laws, at anyone who might still offer him some sympathy. I heard Marcia Dillard say, quietly but audibly, I think we should go, Frank. I heard chairs being pushed back, the specific, unmistakable sound of a dinner party ending in a way no one at that table would ever forget. I stood at my kitchen sink, my father's arm still around my shoulders, and I felt, for the first time in 6 weeks, the full weight of everything land at once. I did not cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect a moment like this to end in tears, and for me, it did not. What I felt instead was something closer to exhaustion, the specific, bone-deep exhaustion of someone who has been holding an enormous structure together through sheer will for 6 straight weeks and has finally set it down. You did the right thing, my father said quietly. However it feels right now. You did the right thing. I know, I said. I just need a minute. He gave me the minute. Then we went back out and helped clear the rest of the table, while Richard sat alone in the dining room, his head in his hands, surrounded by the wreckage of a celebration that had been engineered from the very beginning to expose exactly who he had become. The weeks that followed moved with a speed that surprised me, given how slowly the preceding 6 weeks of preparation had felt. Richard moved out within 4 days, into a furnished short-term rental near his office, though his office was, by that point, a complicated phrase, given that Frank Dillard had initiated a formal partnership review the morning after my birthday, examining the full extent of the financial misappropriation Gerald Pruitt's report had documented. I will not pretend the business consequences were simple or quick. They unfolded over several months, through a separate legal process that ran parallel to my own divorce proceedings. What I can tell you is that by the time both matters were resolved, Richard had been bought out of his partnership at a significantly reduced valuation, given the documented misuse of company funds, and the divorce settlement reflected, in concrete financial terms, the dissipation of marital assets that Diane had identified from the very beginning. I kept the house. I kept my design firm, which had never been entangled with his business finances in the first place, a separation I had maintained deliberately over the years without ever fully understanding, until now, how valuable that separation would become. Vanessa, I later learned through the small, inevitable channels of a tight-knit local business community, resigned from the company within 2 weeks of that dinner. I never spoke to her again. I have no particular feelings about her one way or another. I do not know what she understood about Richard's marriage, what she believed about the nature of their relationship, or how much of his financial behavior she was even aware of. What I know is that the man who made vows to me was Richard, and the weight of what happened belongs, fully and completely, to him. I want to tell you about the first birthday after. It was a small gathering. Janine, my parents, 2 close friends from my design firm, a quiet dinner at a restaurant downtown rather than my own dining room, which I was, frankly, not yet ready to use for celebration again. There was no cake with 39 candles in a careful spiral. There was no phone call timed to detonate in the middle of dessert. There was just an ordinary, pleasant evening with people who had shown up for me, consistently and without complication throughout the entire previous year. Janine raised her glass at one point and said, "To Caroline, who handled the worst year of her life with more grace and precision than anyone I have ever known." To Caroline, the table echoed. I smiled, and for the first time in over a year, the smile required no effort at all. I have thought many times since about why I chose the specific theater of that birthday dinner, why I didn't simply confront Richard privately the moment I discovered the affair, why I built toward that particular dramatic unveiling rather than handling everything quietly behind closed doors. I think the honest answer is this. Richard had spent the better part of a year managing two separate realities, carefully curating what each side of his life was allowed to see. He had become extremely skilled at controlling narratives, softening consequences, presenting himself as the reasonable, generous, thoughtful man at the center of every room. I did not want him to have the opportunity to manage this one. I did not want a quiet conversation in our bedroom that he could later reshape into something smaller, a midlife mistake, a moment of weakness, a story he could eventually tell himself and others that made the betrayal sound survivable, forgivable, contained. I wanted the truth to exist in a room he could not control, with witnesses he could not manage, with evidence that left no room for the kind of careful narrative reconstruction he had clearly become very good at. And I wanted it to happen on the one day that was supposed to be entirely mine, the same day he had decided, with what I can only describe as breathtaking carelessness, to bring his mistress into my home and call it thoughtful. I think, looking back, that I gave him exactly the ending his own carelessness had earned. It has been a little over a year now since that night. My design firm has grown. We took on a fifth employee in the spring, and I recently completed a project that was featured in a regional design magazine, the kind of professional milestone that, a year ago, I would have shared first with Richard and now share, instead, with Janine and my parents and the quiet, steady satisfaction of having built something entirely my own. I've started seeing someone slowly, carefully, a structural engineer named David who I met through a mutual client who has shown in the months I've known him a consistency and transparency that I notice now in a way I never thought to notice before any of this happened. I check things now. I ask questions I never used to think to ask. I am not suspicious by nature, but I am, I think, permanently more attentive than I once was, and I consider that attentiveness a hard-earned skill rather than a wound. I still bake my own birthday cake every year. This year, my 40th, I decorated it with the same careful spiral of candles, the same delicate piped flowers, sitting at my own kitchen table in the house that is fully and completely mine. There was no phone call this year. There did not need to be. I cut the cake myself, surrounded by people who have shown up for me consistently, without complication, exactly the way people who genuinely love you are supposed to show up. I made a wish. I do not need to tell you what it was. I can tell you that I am, finally, exactly where I want to be. I want to tell you about a night, about 4 weeks into my preparation, when I came very close to abandoning the entire plan. It was a Sunday evening. Richard had come home from what he claimed was a late client meeting, a meeting I already knew, from the documentation I had quietly assembled by that point, did not exist on any calendar associated with his actual business. He walked into the kitchen, kissed the top of my head while I was cooking, and asked what smelled so good. "Pot roast," I said. "Your favorite." He sat at the counter while I finished cooking, telling me about his day, an elaborate, detailed account of a client negotiation that I now understood to be entirely fabricated, delivered with the same warmth and easy charm that had made me fall in love with him 14 years earlier. I stood at the stove, stirring a pot of gravy, listening to my husband lie to me with total fluency, and something in me cracked slightly. Not broke, cracked. A hairline fracture of doubt running through the careful resolve I had been building for a month. What if I was wrong to wait? What if the careful, methodical approach Diane had recommended was actually just a sophisticated form of avoidance, a way of postponing the unbearable conversation by hiding inside spreadsheets and forensic accounting reports? I served dinner. We ate at the table together, the same table where, weeks later, everything would detonate during a different meal entirely. He told me I was a wonderful cook. He asked about my day, listened to my answer with what appeared to be genuine interest, and for one disorienting hour, it felt almost exactly like the marriage I remembered having before any of this began. After dinner, washing dishes side by side at the sink, I almost said something. The words were right there, at the edge of my mouth. Asterisk, I know about Vanessa. I know about the hotels. I know about the bracelet. Asterisk, I looked at him, drying a plate, humming slightly under his breath, completely unaware of how close I was to ending the careful theater 6 weeks before it was scheduled to end. I did not say it. I went upstairs instead and called Diane, even though it was nearly 9 o'clock on a Sunday. I almost said something tonight, I told her. What stopped you? She asked. I thought about it honestly before I answered. I think, I said slowly, I was about to confront him out of exhaustion, not out of strategy. And I don't want this to be about exhaustion. I want it to be about precision. That's exactly the distinction that matters, Diane said. Exhaustion makes people confront a spouse too early, with incomplete evidence, in private, where the spouse has every opportunity to manage the narrative. Precision means waiting until the picture is complete enough that there's no narrative left to manage. How much longer until we're there?
2 more weeks, she said.
Pruitt is finalizing the financial report. The temporary asset protections are already drafted and ready to file.
We're close, Caroline.
I know 2 weeks feels like a long time when you're sitting across the dinner table from him every night. But it isn't long in the scope of what you're protecting. I sat on the edge of my bed after we hung up, looking at the closed bedroom door, listening to Richard moving around downstairs, the ordinary sounds of a man finishing the dishes in a house he had no idea was about to become legally and financially complicated in ways he could not yet imagine. I did not say anything that night. I am glad now that I didn't. The 2 weeks that followed were the hardest of the entire 6-week period, not because anything dramatic happened, but because the ordinary, day-to-day performance of normalcy had become almost unbearably heavy by that point. Every dinner felt like an act of extraordinary will. Every casual conversation about his day required a level of internal management I had not anticipated needing to sustain for this long. But I sustained it. 2 more weeks, exactly as Diane had promised, and then we were ready. I want to tell you about a conversation I had with Janine about 3 weeks before the birthday dinner because it shaped the final shape of the plan in a way I think matters. We were having coffee on a Saturday morning. The documentation from Gerald Pruitt's preliminary findings spread across her kitchen table between us, because by that point Janine had become my primary sounding board for every decision in this process. Can I ask you something? She said, looking up from the report. And I want you to actually think about it before you answer. Go ahead. Why does it matter so much to you that other people see this happen? You could handle all of this privately. File the divorce. Deal with the financial side through your attorneys. Never have a single dramatic confrontation at all. Why does the birthday dinner matter? I sat with the question for a long moment because I think it deserved real consideration rather than a quick answer. Because Richard has spent a year being the only person who knew the full truth, I said finally. He's been managing 2 completely separate realities, and the only person forced to live entirely inside the false one has been me. I want, just once, for everyone who matters to see the same thing at the same time, without him having any opportunity to shape how they understand it first. That makes sense, Janine said. But I want to push on it a little. Is there a part of you that wants this because it's also, and I say this with love, a little bit theatrical? A little bit about wanting him to feel what it's like to lose control of the story. I thought about that honestly. Yes, I said. There is a part of that too. I'm not going to pretend there isn't. He took something enormous from me. Not just fidelity, but a year of my life where I genuinely believed I understood my own marriage. I think I'm allowed to want him to understand, just once, completely and totally, what it feels like to lose control of a narrative he assumed he could always manage. Janine nodded slowly. I think that's fair, she said. I just wanted you to be honest with yourself about what's driving this. Not just the practical legal strategy, the actual human one underneath it. I appreciate you asking, I said. I think both things are true. The practical strategy is real. Diane's right that documentation and timing matter enormously for the legal outcome. But you're also right that there's something underneath it that isn't strictly strategic. I want him to feel, even for one evening, what it's like to have something happen to you that you didn't see coming and can't control. Then I think you should do it, Janine said. Both things can be true at once. The strategy and the want. I don't think that makes the plan any less right. I have thought about that conversation many times since. Janine was the only person throughout the entire 6 weeks who asked me to examine my own motivations that directly, not to talk me out of anything, but to make sure I understood fully what I was choosing and why. I am grateful she asked. I think it made the final plan more honest in its way because I went into that birthday dinner with complete clarity about both the strategic and the human dimensions of what I was doing. I have not told you about the conversation I had with my mother the morning after the birthday dinner, and I think it belongs in this story. She and my father had stayed overnight, in the guest room, the plan having always been a quiet Sunday morning departure back to Lancaster. Instead, they woke up to a house that had become, overnight, the site of a marriage's complete and public collapse. My mother found me in the kitchen at 7 in the morning, already dressed, already making coffee, the dining room behind us still bearing the faint, lingering evidence of the previous night, an extra chair pushed slightly out of place, a wine glass someone had left on the sideboard. "How long did you know?" she asked, without preamble, sitting down at the counter. "About the affair?" "Roughly 2 months. About the financial details, the full picture, closer to 6 weeks. "And you didn't tell us." "I didn't tell anyone except Janine and my attorney," I said. I needed to handle it without managing everyone else's reactions on top of my own. My mother was quiet for a long moment, turning her coffee cup slowly in her hands. "I want you to know something," she said finally. "When your father and I got married, almost 40 years ago now, my mother told me something I've never forgotten. She said, 'The women in our family don't fall apart in public. We fall apart in private if we need to fall apart at all, and in public, we handle our business.'" "Is that a compliment or a warning?" "Both," my mother said, with something that might have been the faintest trace of a smile. "I watched you last night, Caroline. I watched you smile at that woman across the table for 2 hours, knowing everything you knew. I watched you cut that cake with completely steady hands. And then I watched you stand up and dismantle your entire marriage with more composure than I have ever managed in a moment of crisis in my entire life." "I didn't feel composed," I said. "I felt like I was barely holding together." "That's exactly what composure is," my mother said. "It's not the absence of falling apart. It's choosing when and where you're allowed to do it. You chose last night to hold it together in that room, and you can choose to fall apart now with me if you need to." I sat down across from her, and for the first time since I had discovered that hotel receipt 7 weeks earlier, I let myself cry. Not in a controlled, private moment in my car or my bedroom, but openly, at my own kitchen counter, with my mother's hand resting steadily on my arm. "You did the right thing," she said, when I had quieted. "Not just last night, the whole 6 weeks of it. Building the case properly, protecting yourself before you said a single word. That's not coldness, Caroline. That's strength applied with precision. There's a difference, and I think you understand that difference better than most people ever learn to." I think about that conversation often. I think my mother gave me, that morning, the clearest articulation I have ever received of what I had actually been doing for 6 weeks, not coldly executing revenge, but applying real strength with real precision, protecting myself first so that the eventual reckoning could not be undone or softened or managed away. I have tried to hold on to that understanding ever since. I want to tell you about one more conversation because I think it completes the picture of everything that happened in the aftermath. About 6 weeks after the dinner, once the partnership dissolution proceedings were well underway, Frank Dillard called and asked if we could meet for coffee. I was surprised by the request. Frank had been Richard's business partner and close friend for over a decade, and I had assumed, reasonably, that whatever loyalty remained between them would make any continued relationship with me complicated at best. We met at a small coffee shop downtown. Frank looked tired in a way I hadn't seen on him before, the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent weeks untangling a business partnership from a foundation of deception he hadn't fully understood until it was too late. "I wanted to apologize to you," he said, once we'd settled with our coffee. I should have said something sooner. I'd had suspicions for months, small things, inconsistencies in expense reports, a general sense that something wasn't right. I told myself it wasn't my business to interfere in someone else's marriage. You don't owe me an apology, Frank. I think I do a little, he said. Because by the time I finally acted, calling Diane's office, trying to understand whether there were business implications, it was already very late. You'd been carrying the full weight of figuring this out almost entirely on your own. I thought about that for a moment. I appreciate you saying that, I said. But I want to be honest with you. Even if you'd come to me 3 months earlier with your suspicions, I'm not sure it would have changed anything about how I handled it. I needed time to build the case properly. I think I would have asked you to wait too. Frank nodded slowly. How are you doing? Genuinely. Better than I expected to be, 6 weeks out, I said. The business is going well. I've kept the house. I'm sleeping again most nights. And Richard? I considered how much to say. I haven't spoken to him beyond what's necessary for the legal proceedings, I said. I don't imagine that will change anytime soon. Frank was quiet for a moment, looking down at his coffee. He was my friend for a long time, he said. I want you to know that doesn't mean I don't understand what he did, or that I'm choosing his side in any of this. I think what he did was inexcusable, both to you and, frankly, to the business we built together. Losing a friendship of that length, even when it's deserved, isn't simple either. I understand that, I said. And I did. I had, after all, lost the same friendship. The version of Richard I had believed I was married to for 14 years. The version that had never actually existed in the way I'd assumed. For what it's worth, Frank said as we were getting ready to leave, the way you handled all of this, the precision of it, the way you protected yourself before you said a word to anyone, I think it was the right way to do it. I don't know that I'd have had the discipline to wait that long, if I were in your position. It wasn't easy, I said. But it was right. I'm certain of that, even now. We finished our coffee. We shook hands at the door, an oddly formal gesture between two people who had been thrown together by someone else's catastrophic choices, and I drove home thinking about the strange, unexpected relationships that sometimes survive the wreckage of a marriage's ending, not the marriage itself, but the people standing nearby who chose, in the aftermath, to act with integrity. I think that conversation with Frank was the final piece of closure I needed. Not from Richard. Not even really from myself. But from someone outside the marriage who could confirm, with no stake in protecting either of us, that what I had done was exactly right. I have not needed much reassurance since then. But I was grateful for that conversation when it came. 1 year later, in detail. I told you earlier about my 40th birthday, the quiet evening, the cake without an audience of unwitting guests, the absence of a phone call timed for maximum effect. I want to describe that evening in a little more detail because I think the contrast matters. I spent the afternoon in my garden, which is something I never had time for during my marriage to Richard, when our weekends were so often filled with his business dinners and client obligations that I had quietly let my own interests shrink to fit around them. I had planted a small bed of dahlias in the spring, and by my birthday in early autumn, they had grown into something genuinely spectacular, deep burgundy and soft coral, blooming in a profusion that surprised even me, since I had planted them somewhat tentatively, unsure whether I actually had the patience for gardening or was simply trying to fill space that Richard's absence had left behind. It turned out I had the patience. It turned out I had quite a lot of patience for things that were actually mine. David came over in the early evening before the others arrived and helped me set the table in the backyard, since the weather had cooperated and I wanted, for the first time in over a year, to use my own outdoor space for something celebratory rather than letting it sit unused the way it had through most of the previous summer. Nervous? He asked, watching me arrange place settings with more precision than the occasion strictly required. A little, I admitted. Not about tonight, specifically. Just, birthdays carry a particular weight now. I don't think that goes away quickly. It doesn't have to go away, he said. It can just become a different kind of weight. One you're carrying on your own terms instead of someone else's. I thought about that for a moment, arranging a final napkin. I like that, I said. A different kind of weight. The dinner itself was simple and warm. Janine and her husband, my parents, two friends from the design firm, David quietly present in a way that felt entirely natural rather than performed. We ate outside, under string lights I had put up myself, the dahlias glowing faintly in the evening light, and the conversation moved easily across a dozen ordinary topics that had nothing to do with the previous year's devastation at all. When it came time for the cake, I carried it out myself. The same careful spiral of candles, the same delicate piped flowers, a recipe I had perfected over a decade of birthdays and had no intention of abandoning just because one particular cake, one particular year, had become attached to something painful. Everyone sang. I closed my eyes. I made a wish that I genuinely cannot tell you, because some things, I have decided, are allowed to remain entirely private, even in a story as thoroughly examined as this one. I opened my eyes. I cut the cake. My phone, sitting on the table beside my plate, did not buzz. There was no call to take, no theater to perform, no evidence to detonate in the middle of dessert. There was just cake and the people who genuinely loved me, and an evening that ended exactly the way it appeared to, with nothing underneath it except exactly what it seemed to be. I think that, more than anything else, is the actual measure of how far I had come. Not the absence of pain, which I do still carry, in smaller and smaller doses, on the anniversaries and occasional unexpected triggers that grief leaves behind even after the practical matters have resolved. But the presence, finally, of an evening that required no hidden architecture at all. Just cake. Just the people who showed up. Just an ordinary, extraordinary kind of happiness that I had built, slowly and carefully, exactly the way I build everything that lasts. If someone came to me today, sitting across the table the way I once sat across from Diane Whitfield for the first time, describing a hotel receipt that didn't match a business trip, or a pattern of late nights that didn't add up, or any of the dozens of small, accumulating signs that something fundamental had shifted in their marriage, I know exactly what I would tell them. I would tell them, do not confront before you are ready. Not because confrontation is wrong, but because timing changes everything about what happens afterward. The moment you say something out loud, the other person gains the ability to manage the story, to soften it, to control what comes next. If you wait, carefully, deliberately, with real documentation and real legal protection in place, you take that control away from them permanently. I would tell them, grief and strategy can exist in the same body at the same time. I cried in my car. I cried at my kitchen counter with my mother's hand on my arm. And in between all of that crying, I built, methodically, a case so complete that there was no room left for anyone to argue about what had actually happened. Both things were real. Neither one canceled out the other. I would tell them, protect yourself financially and legally before you protect your feelings. It feels backward in the moment to prioritize bank statements over heartbreak. But the bank statements are what actually determine your future. The heartbreak, as devastating as it is, will eventually become something you carry rather than something that controls you. The financial protection has to happen first, while you still have the advantage of surprise. And I would tell them this last of all because I think it matters most. You are allowed to want more than just resolution. You are allowed to want the truth to exist in a room full of witnesses, on your own terms, in a moment you control completely. That desire is not vindictiveness. It is not theatrical excess. It is simply the natural response to having lived, for months or years, inside someone else's carefully managed lie. You deserve, at minimum, one moment where the truth belongs entirely to you. I had that moment. I am still, more than a year later, grateful I built it exactly the way I did. The cake. The candles. The phone call timed to the second. It was not cruelty. It was clarity, delivered at exactly the moment it could no longer be avoided, softened, or explained away. That is the whole of what I have to tell you. That is the entire shape of how I survived the worst year of my life, and came out the other side of it stronger, more careful, and finally, completely, in possession of my own story. I am still here. The dahlias are still blooming. The cake is still mine to cut, every single year, exactly the way I choose.